Welcome to Book Dragon Banter, a podcast where three aspiring writers talk all things books. We're fantasy focused, but we're not exclusive. We chat about tropes we love, what characters we love to hate, and everything in between. I'm Zinzi Bree. Hi.
I'm Katherine Suzette.
Hi, I'm Sage Moreau.
And welcome to Book Dragon Banter. This is the episode we are talking about light, dark, and morally gray in fantasy. Light, dark, and morally gray characters, light, dark, and morally gray settings, light, dark, and morally gray as a genre, like how that's defined.
So we are technically an explicit podcast. We might be talking about some darker topics, especially in today's episode.
And we will be talking about books in detail, so there will be spoilers. And you can find a list of the novels that we talk about in our show notes so that you can make sure that there's nothing on your to-be-read list that is about to be spoiled for you.
And you could always skip ahead if you hear it brought up.
They could skip it, or they could just kind of sing in there, la 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 la, as it's being talked about.
Oh, disclaimer. We do use pop culture when we're talking about books, movies, TV shows, music, some other stuff that helps illustrate our points when we're talking about books, because not everybody has read the same books that we have. This is my harebrained idea, this podcast. We were working on other business stuff together, and I went, hey, let's do a podcast. Not knowing at all the amount of work I had just committed, the three of us, but especially myself to.
Yeah.
Because I'm learning to do this all from scratch. So if there's bad audio, if there's bad video, blame me. It's all on me. I'm doing the behind the scenes here. And send tips. Send help. I will take it. So let us get into defining genres of light, dark, and morally gray. Is there morally gray as a genre? Yeah. I specifically looked them up. I went onto Goodreads and was trying, what is the definition? And no, I don't unfortunately have that written down in front of me, but it is in my head, and a little bit of the subgenre breakdowns that are also included for some of them.
I looked it up on Reddit and got some funny answers, but not necessarily anything
I did too.
How could a genre be official outside of romance, where you've got a literary arm organization defining what it is? We don't have that I'm aware of for dark fantasy, cozy fantasy, even fantasy broadly, because there's so much variety. Like, there isn't as narrow with romance. Like, you have to have your HEA or your happily ever after for now. Like, that structure for it to qualify as romance, you can put those guardrails on. But for fantasy, sky's the limit. So let us get into defining, is there morally gray as a genre?
No, I think that morally gray might have to do more with the characters themselves, the decisions, and maybe even what the plot is forcing these characters through. So maybe morally gray applies to any version of book. But I love how it sounds, light, dark, and morally gray. I vote yes to all of the above.
I would agree. I think that there are books where, like The Cruel Prince, for example, which I think a couple of us have read, by Holly Black in the Folk of the Air series, where many of the characters are fairies who are prone to trickery and often don't see morally gray as that's just like their way of life. They don't see it as a problem whatsoever. So the book itself is not a morally gray book, but the setting that the world is in is almost like morally gray is just the average, the normal.
Agree with that.
Maybe even with the advent of all of this romantasy around, I definitely see morally gray characters being the attractive characters these days. That's what people want for some level of believability. And also maybe in some cases like redeemable darkness, or the attraction to darkness itself, which I think also applies to dark fantasy. But when it comes to characters specifically, I think that the morally gray is pretty attractive these days, especially when it comes to romantic interests.
Yeah. I don't know if this is from a female perspective, but like, he's broken and I can fix him is a classic kind of mindset that you see a lot in romance.
Annoys me.
It annoys me too. But I do see that as kind of an element, and I wonder if that lent into but I really like what you said about it being because it's more realistic. If the person is so perfect or always makes the right decision, that doesn't feel like a real life person that you might encounter. So to have the love interest be somebody who is a little rough around the edges, is a little bit somebody you might have to be I've noticed that a lot of morally gray love interests seem like they're bad at first, or making decisions that you don't necessarily think are for the greater good. And then it turns out that they have this ulterior motive and they're hiding something and actually they're working. I'm thinking of like Rysand, A Court of Thorn and Roses. There's a couple other of those like shadow characters where it seems like they're working nefariously, but really they have this really altruistic thing that they are having to make these difficult decisions because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you find out, oh, actually they're this amazing hero and not as morally gray as we thought. Not so much in The Cruel Prince.
Yeah, definitely not. I do have to confess, I got to chapter 5 of The Cruel Prince and I almost DNF'd the book, and it was solely on your recommendation, Sage. I was like, Sage loves this. She thinks it's amazing. I'm going to push through and I'm going to keep going. I'm going to give it a fair shot. And I will explain why. At the chapter 5, there was the scene that they had class where there was a picnic where Jude gets bullied. And then there's a follow-up scene where Jude and her sister are bullied and get thrown into the river. And Carden, who I already knew at that point was supposed to be the love interest, he's part of the bullying. Bully romance is a no. Like, that's nope. Heck no. Not interested. There's a mirror scene of this basically and they're twins too. It's a huge series. It's an astrological.
Oh, the Zodiac.
Yes, Zodiac Academy.
Oh, I
It's
haven't
in,
read that.
there's like a scene just like it in Zodiac Academy. And as soon as I read the mirror of it in Cruel Prince, I was like, oh no. Oh no, oh, no. I do not want this. I put the book down and had to like go walk away for an hour, do something else. I was like, okay, it's not a bully romance. I think I'm gonna keep going. We'll see. And Jude won me over with her gumption. Old-fashioned word there.
A good one,
But
though.
and by the end of the book, I could see this is the perception Jude has of Carden's behavior and what he's actually doing, ways to protect her. I could see that at the end of it. So I came around on The Cruel Prince and want to continue the series. But just for that little bit. So morally great characters.
So I haven't read the Zodiac Academy, but I loved that scene because at the time I recognized they tricked her, if I'm thinking of the right scene, they tricked her into being like bespelled by their magic. And Carden was kind of part of it. And I saw very much that he was kind of like swayed by like the popular kids and he was like trying to be part of he was the prince, so like poor him, but
He is the popular kid.
yeah, he is the popular kid, but like I kind of saw that he was like falling along with the meanness of everybody else, which is not at all something to do. You should stand up to bullies even when they're your friends, etc. But I gave him a little bit of a pass on that. And then when he had her suck her finger because blood is salty and that broke the spell, I saw that right there and I was like, oh, I see where this is going. I'm not going to talk too much about it because you haven't read the whole trilogy.
Yep.
Okay, I have a confession. I did DNF The Cruel Prince at the same point because of that. However, I read the Zodiac Academy and I was so upset. I'm still upset. I just finished book 3. I was listening to it on audio because I'm in a book club group where there's a little bit more interest in some of the darker fantasies or romantasies in general. And
Dark romantasy.
Yeah,
In that case.
I guess it does lean that way.
I don't see that there's a way to make a bully romance that is not dark, in my opinion.
So I think, in retrospect, I was really hoping that they would recover from that more quickly in the Zodiac Academy because it bothers the ever-living daylights out of me. But they are slowly exposing all of the reasons behind it, and I don't think that excuses any behaviors. But they are also bringing in the fact that they're all fae, and it's basically all a little morally gray, and it's totally expected in the culture. And I feel it's kind of like the author just reasoning out ways to go ahead and have a bully romance. So I'm very on the fence about this. I probably will finish it to say I did. I hate DNFing when I've got so far, but I did DNF The Cruel Prince for like 2 years. I finally came back and I finished book 2 probably just right before we met, but so like almost a year ago now. That said, I still haven't picked up the next book because I never got to the point where I was like super committed to the characters. And don't hate me, I DNF'd Outlander because of this scene in which Jamie punishes Claire for doing something that was culturally inappropriate at the time for women. I could not get over Claire not making a big deal of it. See, in the Zodiac Academy, at least the girls are like, let's get our revenge. And then it's this whole revenge fantasy for the two girls for a little while. Like, okay, I can get behind a revenge fantasy. But in Outlander, they just decide, oh, I'll never touch you like that again. And that's what happens. He doesn't. That's it. But as you can see, I have the whole series for Outlander back here, and I still haven't finished them. I think at some point I might, but I'll just skip over book 1. The DNFing bullies is always on par with my moral code.
I did read the first Outlander book, and that scene was super hard for me also. I did keep reading. I'm very rarely DNF, and usually it's when it's not something that I think is well written. One of the things I loved about Cruel Prince is I love Holly Black's writing style. She does write books that are basically girls who fall in love with monsters, and that's a little bit disturbing in general, but kind of like pretty much all of her books. The male character, the love interest, is, if not an actual vampire, fairly monstrous in behavior. And the girls aren't like angels themselves, so there's that. But all of her characters are pretty morally gray or dark. But with Outlander, when that punishment happened, I just never liked him again. Some people really love like the super old-fashioned macho male lead, and that's just not me. What is he, spanked her a bunch?
He whipped her with his
Oh, he
belt.
whipped her. Right, see, I blocked it out. And I agree with you. How could she accept that and just be like, oh, well, because he's so hot?
Made me
The
love Claire a
sexist-
lot less, too. I
know?
couldn't stand by her for the rest of that book. Although the TV series did recover a lot of that, to be fair.
Back to, now that we've just totally got off into romance land. Well, historical fantasy romance for Outlander.
Can we talk a little bit about defining what makes it a dark fantasy versus horror fantasy?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference with that, or grimdark? If we're talking that morally gray as characters, there is still, I think, a spectrum of dark.
I was seeing when I looked it up for dark fantasy, it was usually that both the main characters and the setting is ambiguous. There's not a clear moral code necessarily. There isn't clear, this is good, this is bad in the world. And there were some subgenres like grimdark and gothic fantasy, which out of those, a gothic fantasy is most likely what I would read over dark fantasy that's more brutal in having violence and war and murder and rape and dark magic. So here's an example. Maybe you ladies will have a book that has this, that is dark fantasy, where there's blood rituals and blood sacrifices. There's blood mages. Okay. I'm currently reading and very much enjoying the Villains and Virtues series by A.K. Caragino. I think it's Caragino. I'm probably mispronouncing her name. But main character in that, he's a blood mage. And he's considered evil. There's some very clear, these are supposed to be the good gods, and these are the bad gods, and these are demons. And there's some very clear lines about what is and is not considered good as far as morality goes. And there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of fun and lightness in the series. Another similar one is like Assistant to the Villain, where you've got a bad guy who is either perceived by good as bad or is bad, but not in a because I can fix him way, but just because the heroine is goodness and kindness incarnate makes the male lead character want to earn her and deserve her, and then shifts his behavior throughout the story. Like those are, but him being a blood mage, like how it's used feels very different in that where it's a lighter fantasy or even more gothic-y versus like in blood rituals where there's no remorse, there's no thinking about it, there's just death and I get the power But I have not read those other dark books where that has the heavier version of blood mage or blood magic.
Okay, so one of my recommendations at the end of the show is going to be Hellbent, and there is some darkness like that. But the characters do struggle with the decisions, but they end up making them for the better good, so to speak. And then I also am thinking of Anne Rice's series, especially when it comes to
Interview with a Vampire.
Interview with a Vampire. Yes, I also love her wolf books probably a lot more, honestly. But in Interview with a Vampire, there are very morally gray, if not truly dark characters all over that don't necessarily have a ton of redeeming qualities, and yet they still end up living pretty decent lives and whatnot. There's definitely dark blood rituals. There's massacres that the vampires don't even think twice about. So maybe that qualifies as one of the more horrific branches of dark fantasy.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because, like, I just read Assistant to the Villain, and that has some torture referenced. But to me, it's humorous and it's pretty lighthearted, and the violence is toned down, right? It's not described in detail. It's almost like it happens, but the most resonant violence was the almost sexual assault against the main character that had happened in her past. That's what resonated with me the most, was that and the betrayal at the end that happens to the main character.
Spoilers.
That bothered me more than severed heads hanging from the walls. That's kind of like flippantly talked about. So I wouldn't consider that to be a dark
Squishing
fantasy.
eyeballs beneath her boot.
Exactly. I've read lots of various vampire supernatural fantasy, where some of it is same thing. It's just kind of vampires over there and they're sucking the blood out of people, and it's not super, that's dark, but it's not written super dark. It's written more morally gray almost, or it's a gray book versus a light book or a dark book. And then there's some where it is like extremely gruesome. And I would say the Anne Rice stuff is a little more on the dark side than maybe more like YA vampire stuff. I'm thinking of Vampire Diaries, for example, where yes, the characters are vampires, but they're also hot and you can kind of find redeeming qualities about them. Is that then supernatural versus being dark fantasy? And then is there a line between having this violence versus it being really dark because the characters don't have remorse around the violence that is being created, or there's no hope in the world? I feel like a lot of really dark stuff, you just know it's not going to turn out well for anybody.
So what I'm hearing is that we need like a gray scale to place the books on this line, like just how dark and just how light. And yeah, maybe we should have light gray and dark fantasy. And then the morally gray can just apply to characters in general. So it's more of a characterization. But we have light gray and dark fantasy. And that said, the gray scale, maybe that's relevant at some point, like just how light, just how dark. Because the spell shop, the little spell shop, that is definitely light for me. Like, I never questioned if the characters were morally gray. I never questioned whether or not any heavy or dark topics would come in. And it was sweet. And, you know, it lived up to its promise. I mean, yeah, it was an amazing book. It was light, for sure. I feel no question on that one.
I'm so excited for the Enchanted Greenhouse to come out. It's so soon, which is same world, same author, and one of the characters that was mentioned in the spell shop. So the spell shop is a great example of what light fantasy is. It's cozy fantasy. Actually, I just saw it when I was looking it up on the interwebs. It called cozy or light fantasy noble bright. Because when I think of the characters that I would consider cozy fantasy characters, in particular, like Evie in Assistant to the Villain, she's all things. She's bright, she's good-hearted, she's noble intentions. Bright both in that she's intelligent, but also that she's a very upbeat character. Possibly obnoxiously upright.
Classic Grumpy Sunshine.
For some people. Yes. The idea of it being noble bright, that to me felt like a good lens for kind of defining the characters in cozy fantasy. I just recently read Dreadful by... Nope, I'm not going to be able to pronounce the last name. It'll show up on screen on YouTube and it'll be in the description, which was recommended to me from one of the people in my writing group. And it is gothic cozy fantasy because the plot is a dark lord that had something backfire on him to where he lost his memories of how he became the Dark Lord.
Oh, I've heard of this
And
one.
so he's spending the book trying to figure out who he was, if he wants to be that person, if he wants to be who he is now, and trying to figure out the things that are the plot that he's gotten himself into with fellow dark wizards. Does he want to help them? Does he want to foil them? What does he do with the princess that he's keeping in the dungeon? It had lots of gothic elements. There's a character that gets burned to death. Not by the main character, is just not burned somebody to death on the page. But he had previously done that in his Dark Wizard past. He's dealing with a lot of these things, but the tone of it was still so humorous. It didn't have a moralistic, like, this is good, so you should be good. It was a very natural, well-written way of bringing this character who had, in a past life, been one version of himself and then now choosing, I didn't like that version of myself. I would like to go in a different direction. Whether that's good or whether it's just different remains to be seen, because I'm hoping there'll be a sequel.
Did you finish the book?
Yes.
I haven't read it. Was there much about whatever it was that happened in his past that made him into that dark person? Because I would imagine if you had this, a lot of characters have a wound or a ghost in their past that they need to overcome or drags them down. And if you lost your memory of that, maybe you wouldn't be affected, and all of a sudden you might not having this dark thing that has happened to you. I could see that turning you into a very different person if you don't remember it. That's one of my favorite things when talking about, because I don't read a ton of light fantasy. The things I love is when there's like a really evil villain and you find out why they're so evil and you start to have a little empathy for them, even though you don't necessarily still agree with their choices or want them to be redeemed or anything like that. That kind of lends itself with the morally gray characters, because then your characters are giving these reasons for why they're making these choices, and it makes you think more deeply about what would you do then in that situation, right? It's real easy from your chair that you're reading in to be, those choices are so poor and I'm so altruistic, but in that position, you might make very similar choices. It's an interesting kind of personal reflection. And that's one of the things I love most about morally gray characters.
Nice. Thinking back to trying to define dark fantasy, I wonder what you guys think about this. So we've discussed a little bit about the horror elements in fantasy and whether or not that classifies it as like a horror fantasy or a fantasy horror as opposed to just dark. And I'm not sure there's a great answer to that. But what do you guys think of the ones that I think of as spiritually morally gray at best, if not spiritually dark? Bringing up some pretty deep questions there. And one that comes to mind right now is called Slewfoot. It's a woman who is accused of being a witch at a time when witches were burned. So she goes and makes a pact with what we think for most of the book is a demon, but which we learn is more of a nature spirit who was out for revenge. So it does change her, and in a way it becomes almost her own villain arc because she goes on a rampage. But by the time we get there, we are all in full support of her absolutely destroying this village in the most bloody way possible. And then we're like, hell yeah, go live your best nature-loving self with the nature spirits that take revenge on humans who disrespect the nature. So it's really spiritually dark because I really thought for most of the book it was almost demonic. I put it down several times. I was like, I'm not sure I can get behind this decision, but by the end it totally recovered it for me, and then I just found it to be a really interesting introspective journey for me, thinking about why I let myself be led on the journey I did by the author. So I guess back to my point, how do we feel about more spiritually dark being classified in the dark fantasy realm?
Was there a lot of the bloody retribution? Was that shown on the page? Like, was it?
It wasn't the most
described?
graphic, but it was definitely there. It was talked about, not necessarily experienced in a really deep way.
I'm trying to think if I've read any books where it is more like spiritually dark.
I mean, I have read some from particular perspectives, like a Christian perspective, thinking of something like Piercing the Darkness. That was one that I read way, way back when.
Frank Peretti.
I felt at the time when I read that it was so dark, but it was all Christian perspective. It was all about spiritual warfare and all that kind of thing. And I felt so complicated about it. So I would classify that one as dark. It's not fantasy. So it might not belong in the podcast. I think that's that deep level of like a book that can push you to be deeply introspective about your own spiritual perspectives and reactions and the spiritual plane and all of that. Does that still qualify as fantasy, or does that like push it out of that realm? And is it just dark, or is it just weirdly thought-provoking and generally strange? I don't know. I don't have an answer for myself.
When it comes to This Present Darkness, Frank Peretti's, that's actually one of my favorite depictions of both angels and demons that I've read. Not that I've read a lot of that, but to me, whether you consider it spiritual or not comes from, are you a spiritual person? What is your faith? Like, as someone who's a Christian, like, I can look at that book both from the lens of, this is fantasy because it's still, the Chronicles of Narnia is still fantasy. It's allegory. It's still an author's interpretation of what that could be. So I would still call it fantasy. It makes my brain bounce over to one of my other favorite depictions of demons is C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. It's not cozy fantasy, but the tone is so humorous but manipulative between these two demons that are writing to each other about how to manipulate this chosen human towards sin and going to hell or whatever. And it's fascinating, and it's also short. So now I'm like, I'm going to reread that because it's a little bit fun. There's some, and I don't get the attraction for here's the morally gray hero who's hot. I get the attraction to like, this is fun, like evil that's fun, evil that's funny, evil that is delighting in its ability to manipulate. Like, that is what is attractive to me if I'm going to read something that has darkness and evil deeds. Loki would be like,
good one.
I'm going to read about Loki.
Yeah.
That's beautifully played by Tom Hiddleston. And even early on in his journey, like, he's bad at being evil and he's ineffectual sometimes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Sorry, not books. I'll take it back, although comics, if that wanted to count. I need some books that have, maybe we'll add that in our book club because we're trying to do stuff that's mythologically inspired. Somebody in the comments, give me your Loki books. Where are the Loki as the love interest, Norse mythology books?
But there's a ton of fanfic.
Send it to me.
There is actually, I haven't read it, but there is a Loki book. I believe it is a Disney produced novel. It's a Marvel Disney approved, but it is written by, I can't remember her name. She wrote The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. I'm pretty sure it's that author.
That's on my TBR.
She was brought on to write this book about Loki. I think it's just called Loki. And I started it and it was super funny. I had just read like the first page because it's just sitting on my shelf. So once I read that, then I will add a comment, whether it's a recommendation or not. So
okay,
back to light, dark, and morally gray. I was thinking about it as we were getting ready for this podcast. Had I really read anything super light, and had I ever read anything super dark? Because I feel like I am first and foremost a fan of epic fantasy. I feel epic fantasy often falls a little more in the middle where there is dark elements, but there's also like these amazing heroes that, come out to save the day. So things generally end up pretty happy at the end. I did start realizing that I had read more dark fantasy. I don't know if either of you have read this, but Joe Abercrombie wrote the first Law trilogy, and the first one's called The Blade Itself, and it's very like sword fighting. At the three main characters, there's a berserker called the Bloody Nine, and then there's the torturer, who was my favorite character, and this is an example of like this. It's not blood ritual so much, but he is a torturer. He's literally cutting people up. And it goes pretty graphic into it. And yet I loved him as a character. And there was a little bit of humor. The third character was this wannabe noble prince who took on the role of the good guy, but was not a very nice person inside. And the way that the author like took these kind of tropes and flipped them was so beautifully done. It is gritty. There's lots of blood and violence and stuff. I would actually say if there was a morally gray genre, even though there's darkness in it, that would be like a morally gray series, because you really don't come out with feeling like anything in the world is anything but complex. Have either of you read that one?
No, I haven't, but you're making me think of the Game of Thrones right now, where all of the characters have their own little morally gray journey, if not morally bad, and some of them become a little better, some of them become worse, some of them just die because they live their little violent bit and that's all they were useful for. But I don't know the book that you're talking about, but it does make me think of the Game of Thrones and just how gritty that one is.
Yeah, it has a similar kind of dark vibe, but there's maybe a bit more humor. Not a lot of humor, but a little bit more humor than Game of Thrones.
Dungeon Crawler Carl. It's lit RPG, but that's one of the darkest fantasies that I have read.
I've heard of that one.
I was listening to that. I got through the first couple of books and then had to stop because one, I had binged them, but two, just like being immersed in the grittiness and the death, and the humor is fantastic, but it didn't balance out the darkness for me, and this happened to my husband too, where we both were like, we have to take a break from this. And I haven't gone back to that series yet because it got too dark. So there's a question we can talk about is how dark is too dark? I would assume, as I don't read very much dark fantasy, that dark humor would also be you're chopping up body parts and then thinking about that you're going to make soup later. And, oh, this man's arm is kind of like a chicken leg where you just rip it off.
Gosh.
And it's the same thing. And then
Are you sure you don't read a lot of dark fantasy?
Yeah, the inside of Zinzi's
Maybe
head,
you
you
should
guys.
write it.
well, I might just be thinking more Dungeon Crawler Carl, where at some point you're strong enough you could just rip somebody's arm off and then beat them with it. But that's probably also because some of the movies like Deadpool, he could rip his own arm off and then beat somebody with it and a new arm would grow back in. At first it would be the really awkward little baby hand arm and then grow the rest of the way out.
Right, like the dark humor changes it from being super dark.
Okay, so as a reader, I read primal light and cozy, and if they're dark or morally gray, it's because they're funny. That's what gets me to read those books. Versus Sage, sounds like much more, you read darker, complex, epic, high fantasy, hopefully with humor, but not necessarily. And you're saying for you, lighter books, what about them doesn't attract you to them?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I really love the morally gray complexity of characters. First of all, like you nailed it. I like complex plots and I like characters having to make decisions that are complicated and are not who is always doing the right thing. They're more maybe selfish. They have something in them driving them to make decisions that are not always the most altruistic decision. So I like the idea that story is a way for us to learn how we would make choices. Obviously, I don't live in a swords and sorcery type world and I'm not making those kinds of choices. But when the characters have a morally gray perspective, it gives a little more insight into why people make the kinds of choices that they do. And as to why I don't really go for light, I think I just like drama. That's what it comes down to. I'm not a very dramatic person. My life is pretty steadfast. I am conflict avoidant, and so I get my drama from my books.
I love that because you can kind of close the cover on it, put it on a shelf, and come back when you're ready for more, too. Whereas life drama, you can't.
100%.
Cool. I guess I'll answer for dark then. I read across the board. I love light, gray, and dark fantasy. But when it comes to dark, what attracts me to it when I'm in the mood for something darker is usually because I like the introspection of it. And I like a little bit of the reality of it in a sense too. And I actually kind of like how some of it avoids drama. It kind of skips over some of that because that's never what's most important in the plot. And that makes me think of Leigh Bardugo's recent, I mentioned it earlier, guys.
Hellbent?
No, I mean, I love Hellbent. Highly recommend that one. But this recent one that she wrote, it's got to be something else. What? The Familiar. The Familiar. That is what it's called.
Oh, yeah.
It's called The Familiar. And it definitely makes one think about their moral leanings, I guess. Like, who do I agree with in this situation? And in the end, I fully support, again, the main character. Leigh Bardugo really walks that line really well of building characters that you might eventually come to dislike, but that you never do. You can still fully get behind their ultimate decisions. So there I am with dark fantasy. I like ones that are kind of deep, more provoking.
Can I ask a quick question about the idea of like horror fantasy? Is that dark fantasy, or do we think that that's something even more like dark fantasy, but
I
with
think it
like
depends.
lots of gore?
So I think this has to do with tone because
Mm.
I recently read How to Get a Girlfriend When You're a Terrifying Monster, where one of the main characters is a part of a Cthulhu life-devouring, life-ending monster. But the tone of it was just fun. There was existential crisis for that character being like, I'm not human. I'm this terrible void monster. What do I do with that? How do I exist in the not void realm as this thing? So I very much think it has to do with treatment of tone, treatment of setting. And I love that the book world is doing this more, where they're going, what is this bizarre thing? Can I take a Cthulhu character and make it lovable, make it want a girlfriend, set it in a academic, scientific location? I feel like now we're seeing a lot more play with those kinds of things across genre tones, whether it is dark, whether it is cozy and light, than even a decade ago.
When it comes to deciding if a book is more of a fantasy horror or a dark fantasy, like what is the most prevalent part of the story? What's the driving part? Is it the fantasy that we are so concerned with? Is it that we are trying to represent this graphic horror? Okay, great. If those are the two things, then it's a fantasy horror. But if it just so happens to be like a fantasy with romance and a super strong evil versus good arc that horror happens to play into, I would probably just lump that into a dark fantasy. So maybe it just comes down to what's the purpose of the novel.
So less about amount of blood and gore on the page and more about the purpose behind it, behind showing that.
Or the plot arcs themselves, like what is the relevance of that element, that horror element, to the plot.
Nice, because I steer away from horror-based stuff generally, but there has been some like body horror that I've read that I love, even though I'm surprised that I love it. I just read They Bloom at Night. It's not exactly a fantasy. It's probably more, what's the word, like dystopian, because it's like a near future calamity where an environmental disaster starts creating these monstrous creatures, and the teenage main character gets involved in the situation, and it's a lot about who you are as a person. There's some gender stuff in there, and then it's excellent. I think I cried at the end. It's pretty intense, hard to read. But there was enough monstery stuff in there that it's, well, is this horror? Is it, I guess it's dark, like dark dystopia. I mean, dystopian, always dark. But it didn't exactly have fantasy because there wasn't magic in there. But there is, it's kind of like what we were talking about, how the genres are starting to blur or are harder to define as people experiment with different things.
Yeah. Who's your favorite morally gray character that you've read?
Okay, I'm going to just say Man in Blackbeak is my favorite morally gray character from a Throne of Glass series. She comes out later in the series, and she's this witch who has a great, I just love her character arc, how she bonds with her wyvern mount that she takes on she's meant to be the heir of her clan of witches, and she is supposed to be this badass and have no emotion or goodness within her. And her grandma, who's the one who raised her, basically is super hard on her and expects her to be so tough. And then this very compassionate side starts to bloom between her relationship with her and her wyvern, who is, she chose like the runt of the litter and bonded with him. And when they Braxis, and then the relationship between the two of them is like what makes her so amazing to me. I love that. And just seeing her kind of come through the expectation of her upbringing and finding her true self and what she actually believes in. And she doesn't inherently become a good person by the end of it, but she becomes a much more likable. And well, I liked her all along, even when she was killing humans and talking about eating them and stuff. So I just like loved her from the start. But then seeing her character arc, I really enjoyed that quite a lot. And that's why she's my favorite.
What about you, Catherine?
I cannot come up with like just one. I love so many. And honestly, I'm probably not even thinking of whomever would be my favorite. What I did is I looked at the shelf behind me real quick and I pulled out a couple. So I kind of do think of the MCs in the Night Circus as morally gray.
Yeah.
The art plot is more about winning the game that they are all involved in, as opposed to making the right decisions for the human being behind the decision. So I definitely think there's some moral grayness in there, and also the tone is just amazing.
I think because we've decided that morally gray is not a genre, and you can find morally gray characters in the whole spectrum of fantasy, right? From the very most light, you might still have a slightly morally gray, like villain perhaps, or side character, all the way to super dark.
And moreover, it's an industry-wide preference these days to have characters with complicated interiority that tends to push them into the morally gray area, as opposed to, say, 50 or 100 years ago when characters were a lot more cookie cutter because that's the way culture preferred it at the time. They really liked things to be closer to black and white as much as possible to be super culturally acceptable. And now we don't. We almost rebel against that now as a culture.
To me, it feels much easier to pick out because when it comes to a morally gray character, there is so much thought into, would I make the same decisions? Do they grow? Those sorts of things. Like if you have a character that is just good, or even a character that's just bad, they're not equally as memorable, are they? Like, do you have a character that you can think of that like, this is a wholly good character that I love and want to talk about?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. This is comic books, not the movies, but Batman versus Superman. Superman, I think maybe in later comics he got some like moral complexity, but he was just good. He did what was right. He was always so good. And Batman was so dark and conflicted. And I loved Batman so much. My brother had all these comics and I would read all of them. And I loved Batman because he was complicated. And to me, Superman was super boring.
Yes.
And, you know, there was some things about him that I liked, but in general, he was just kind of dull. So I can keep thinking, but that's my initial response is the like bright hero is a little bit boring.
So I grew up with watching Smallville, and so Superman's my guy, and Captain America. I like the guys that make the moral choices and, you know, are always they're gonna do Captain America's case. They're gonna do the stupid thing because it's right.
Can't do that.
Whereas I just love Tony Stark. It's
Same.
like 100% Tony
Same.
Stark.
Anyway, I like their coming of age stories where they're, you know, developing into that good person who's going to make the moral choice in spite of the sacrifices that they'll have to make to make the good choice.
Interesting. Even just talking about this, I want to go back and add a character to my favorite Morley Gray's list and add The Witcher to it.
Please do.
Oh.
He's a really good, complex Morley Gray character who we all love to love and feel complicated about at other times, especially some of the other characters in the book, like his romantic interest, Purple Eyes, whatever her name is.
purple eyes.
Yeah.
I
It'll
don't
have to do
remember
for
her
now.
name, but she had a weird, yeah.
Yennefer. It's Yennefer.
That's it.
Yes. She's definitely morally gray, and we all love her and we all hate her. And I think that she's a well-built character, at least from what I've read. I haven't finished the whole series. I also want to go back and amend my previous statement about our culture is rebelling against morally predictable good and bad characters. And in the sense that I think 100 years ago, our world was in such a place with all the wars and everything, or our nation was, that was the rebellion against the darkness that they saw in the real world.
It does feel like right now there's a big trend towards cozy in recent years, possibly stemming from upheavals in the world over the last number of years. Cozy has always existed, and I don't know if it's just that there's more being published in like the fantasy genre, for example. But I remember reading cozy mystery as a kid, and that definitely existed, right? But it does feel like there's a trend towards people wanting something comforting. But then I also think there is a trend towards people wanting we want to see our heroes be like real people who are struggling, and it's not easy for them, and they still do what's right. Because I think that that's how we as humans who are struggling, we want to see that you can still do what's right through the struggle. And that now makes for a really good hero. And so I think that lends people into loving the morally gray, complex characters a little bit more, especially when they come out doing the right thing or the best thing that they can do in the situation.
Or if they make the wrong decisions and then have to figure their way out of whatever hole they've dug for themselves because of that decision. That's also very relatable for humanity. I mean, how many times have we stuck our foot in our mouths at a very important moment and our characters do that? And we're like, why did you do that? It was a simple decision to keep your mouth shut. And yet the characters go and do it, and we're embarrassed for them, and we hate them for it. And they didn't make the right decision, clearly. But then they figure their way out of the hole, and they rebuild our trust with them as characters. And eventually their growth arc makes us love them even more than wherever we started with them.
When you said about put the characters that put their foot in their mouth, I was like, oh, that's like me this whole podcast. As I
That's my whole
interrupt
life
people
story.
and start talking about comic books.
We don't do a good job of sticking to point still.
That's assuming we had points to begin
Okay,
with.
fair.
It's guidelines. They aren't hard rules, Pirates of the Caribbean here. It's guidelines.
One of my favorite movies of all time.
What is your book recommendation for light, dark, and morally gray? I'm going to do mine real quick here. So my recommended read is Thrown in the Dark by A.K. Caggiano. Caggiano. I feel so bad that I'm screwing up your last name, but your books are delightful. And I highly recommend, if you liked Assistant to the Villain, it is very much in that vein, although I'm pretty sure it was written first, where you've got Grumpy Sunshine, magic, blood mages. It's loads of fun. There's a imp sidekick with a lot of attitude. I highly recommend the audiobook. There's 2 narrators who do a really good job, in my opinion, of bringing the characters to life. So, Thrown in the Dark, the Villain and Virtue series by A.K. Caggiano.
Added to my to be read. I am going to recommend a gray fantasy. It's The Gilded Wolves by Roshani Chokshi, I believe is how you pronounce her last name. And it is a heist fantasy that takes place in an alternate Earth. It's kind of like a historical fantasy with a heist element. And I love heist stories in general, and it lends itself to a lot of morally great characters. I believe that there are 5 point of view characters in this book. There's a couple romance subplots. It's the first of a trilogy, so be prepared for that. It's a lot of fun.
I will go ahead and recommend Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. I think that is an excellent book. It leans to the dark. I wouldn't say that it's outrageously dark.
Thank you so much for listening. This has been Book Dragon Banter. We are a baby podcast, so please, 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 please subscribe, rate, and review, and all the things that you feel inspired to do. Our book club read episode is The Last Dragon of the East by Katrina Kwan. So if you want to pick that up and read it before we cover it, you can find us on social media. And outside of the podcast, you can't really find me, Zinzi Bree, on the internet because I don't really go to other places. But I do run a cozy little corner of Zoom writing in person meetups several times a week. If you're interested in that, send us an email.
So you can find me at sagemoreau.com. It's Moreau with an X. I'm also on Instagram and Substack, which is where I'd really love you to follow me. So go ahead and check that out.
And I'm Katherine Suzette. You can type in katherinesuzette.com, or you can hit me up at bookdragoneditorial.com. They will both take you to the same site. I can be found on social media as Katherine Suzette Book Editor. So go find me and feel free to send me a DM.
You can get your Book Dragon Banter fix every other week on Tuesday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bloopers.
We didn't do our
did it.
fun facts. Catherine and I didn't do fun facts. I'm Sage Moreau, and a fun fact about me is that I regularly debate in my mind whether I am lawful good or neutral good. I think I'm lawful good like 98% of the time, so I don't know. Does that make me neutral good?
I don't know. Zinzi said earlier something about the villains that she likes and everything. Maybe she's chaotic good. What do you think, Zinzi? If Sage is neutral good, are you chaotic good?
Oh, absolutely chaotic good.
Okay. I might be chaotic morally gray. I don't know.
Chaotic neutral? That's like
That's
a
chaotic
big
neutral.
Chaotic
challenge.
neutral.
I'm such a huge rule follower that people that play board games with me know that we have to like take multiple breaks to check the rule manual to make sure that we're playing the game correctly.
Okay. Well, then maybe we figured it out. My fun fact is that if there's a way to cheat at a game and I can figure it out, I probably will.
Oh, that's great. I have an entire wall full of board games in my house and like a very fancy, expensive table, most expensive piece of furniture that we own, that is a board gaming table. And I am the person that reads the rules, but I am also the first person to go, this rule sucks. Let's make a house rule that makes it more fun.
It'll be interesting when the three of us get together and play some board games.
Yeah, we'll be eagerly-eyed staring at Catherine to being like, how is she cheating?
It actually might be a terrible idea because that might be the end of the podcast.
Oh, no. I hope not.
I'm going to bring my deck of Sabak, and we're going to play Sabak because
I have no idea what that is.
Star Wars poker.
Oh.
Star Wars poker. Well, Star Wars blackjack, actually.
Okay.
And we are going to play it for, like, Starbursts or M&Ms
Oh,
or
nice.
popcorn.
Fair. That's fair.
Because that's the only way I will play with you. If I know one of you is absolutely going to cheat and the other one is going to start throwing stuff if we don't follow the rules.
Yeah,
And at least
M&Ms
we'll already
right
have
at your
food
forehead.
at the table to just throw
Okay,
in.
when we finally get to go on our own personal retreat where we get to meet each other, do all of our photos and everything, we'll do a game sesh and we'll all have our little mics and we'll just like record and do like a little highlights what it's like.
Yes. Yeah.
Of all of
That'll
the
be, you
M&Ms
know.
bouncing off your forehead.
Well, that
No,
or
I'm
you've got
not-
like
I'm
the
calm.
behind the scenes of us trying to like catch in your mouth.
Oh, yeah.
I suck at that, so it'll be
too.
entertaining. Or, yep.
That's what cleavage is for.
Shh.
Please don't put that. Just no, I just feel you just over it. Okay, I quit. I'm fired from podcast.
We're so unhinged by the end of this. It's amazing.